It's up a nickel from yesterday's close. The February price for West Texas Intermediate crude oil, $19.01 U.S. a barrel. And we'll have more business news for you later.
Well, the grounding of a tanker in the Shetland Islands yesterday reminds us yet again of the dangers of sea transport of oil and the fragility of the environment. Canada has so far escaped a major catastrophe, but spills are not unknown in Canadian waters. For example, in 1970, the tanker Arrow broke up after hitting a rock in Chebucto Bay, Nova Scotia. Features were fouled along many parts of the coastline in Nova Scotia there. Less than a decade later, the tanker Kurdistan broke up in the Cabot Strait, that's between Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, triggering yet another spill and more environmental damage. Since then, industry and government have been working on different ways of lessening the risk of a major tanker accident in Canadian waters. We're going to talk about that now, and we are joined from Ottawa by Gerald. Mr. Graham is an expert on marine safety who has not only advised the Canadian government but also foreign governments on how to reduce the risk of oil spills. And again, he joins us from Ottawa. Mr. Graham, good morning.
Good morning, Bob.
That ship that went aground on the Shetland coastline there was a ship that was headed for Canada. Give us an idea how much tanker traffic we have in Canadian waters.
Well, Bob, we have several hundred entries and exits of tankers into Canadian waters each year. Some of them would be from Europe. In fact, in 1988, a similar tanker sank about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. It was headed for Canada. So these ships are regularly coming into our waters, both on the east and west coasts.
I think I heard last night that I think a third of all the Alaskan oil comes by ship down along the coast of British Columbia.
That's right. There are something like 4 super tankers per day that are coming into the Strait of Juan de Fuca from Alaska, either to Cherry Point or Port Angeles.
Now, every time an accident like this happens, there's a lot of discussion about what can be done to prevent another accident from happening in the future. We had a lot of talk about that after the Exxon Valdez, which hit pretty close to home in Alaska. Is there anything that has been put in place in recent years to prevent an accident of this type happening in Canadian waters?
Yes, actually, Bob, several measures have been taken. You'll recall that back in '89 there was a significant spill off the west coast, the Nestucca barge. That led to the appointment of the Tanker Safety Panel, which was headed by David Brander Smith, a Vancouver lawyer. There was also a big inquiry in BC headed by David Anderson on tanker safety. And of course, under the Green Plan, the government's response to the Tanker Safety Panel with its 102 recommendations was a several faceted program to prevent spills and to make sure that when they do occur, we have the wherewithal to deal with them.
Well, what were some of those main recommendations? You said there's 102. We don't have time to go into all of them, but what were some of the main recommendations, and have they been put in place?
Well, one of the main recommendations, Bob, was that double-hulled tankers gradually be phased in over a 7-year period, and that a levy of $2 per ton be imposed on the shipment of all oil in Canadian waters, which would pay for research and development and for cleanup equipment and other measures.
But that recommendation for double-hulled tankers, which is again being talked about, is that simply a recommendation, or is there any sort of clout that would require people who build tankers to ensure that they are double-hulled?
Well, it would be a recommendation that eventually we would hope would be implemented. There are similar measures being taken internationally, as you know, through the International Maritime Organization. It's difficult for Canada to impose unilateral controls. We have to be somewhat in step with where all countries are going on this matter.
That sort of leads me to the next question then. What sort of policing powers does the Canadian government have over tanker traffic in Canadian waters?
Well, one measure that Canada can take is to inspect vessels. Along with other port states, Canada has adopted the goal of inspecting 25% of the tankers, the foreign tankers that come into our waters, and we hope that other countries will also inspect vessels when they come into their ports, and we share information with other countries to make sure that every vessel is adequately inspected. It has to be done because in 1987, I believe, a British tanker was coming into Canadian waters, the Dodsland, and it was discovered to be unseaworthy. And so we have beefed up our inspection component, and we hope that you know, ships like this will not run aground.
But one does get the sense, just by looking at some of the past disasters that have happened, that there is no real foolproof mechanism for transporting oil at sea. That, you know, if we had a tanker that was in the same sort of weather conditions that happened in the Shetlands with a double hull, it probably wouldn't have done much good, would it?
That's right. The double hull does not necessarily ensure that the ship does not run aground. It could still be broken up. There are all sorts of factors that can be taken into account. We are vulnerable, there's no doubt about it. Off our shores, we have some of the stormiest seas in the world, off the Grand Banks and off the Pacific coast where the Alaskan tankers come down. It's very treacherous sailing there. So we have to take steps. We can have training, better trained crews. One of the problems with these ships is that they often have multinational crews where they're Filipinos, Greeks, Africans, and they have trouble communicating. We don't know what the precise cause of this catastrophe was, but it could be any number of things. It could have been vessel, faulty equipment on the vessel. We're not quite sure.
Let's come back to Canada, though, Mr. Graham. If a catastrophe like this did happen off the west or east coast, how capable are we of dealing with that in terms of cleanup once something like that happened? Where are we with that?
I think we're extremely vulnerable, Bob. That's why we have to make sure that these spills are prevented by keeping the tankers as far offshore as possible. There is virtually no country in the world that can adequately respond to a spill of this magnitude. Mm-hmm. The Tanker Safety Panel defined a catastrophic spill as anything over 10,000 tons. Well, this is over 80,000 tons. Mm-hmm. When you're presented with a spill of this magnitude in the conditions that exist there with the hurricane force winds and the rough seas, nobody anywhere can really respond adequately. Even if you have all the equipment in place, you cannot deploy it. We have equipment depots in Canada in 52 locations, but if you can't get it out there and if you can't even get men on board the ship, then you're extremely vulnerable.
That's very evident, isn't it, from what we just saw in the Shetlands as well. I mean, they had equipment there very quickly, but they really couldn't do too much with it because of the conditions of the sea. Now, in terms, you mentioned a moment ago of keeping ships as far off the shoreline as possible, particularly, I guess, on the west coast when they're transporting down to Port Angeles from Alaska. Yes. How far now do ships have to stay off the coast? What are the requirements there?
Well, it varies. Of course, when a ship is coming into port, it has to necessarily come close to the coastline, but as a general rule, one would want to try to keep the ships out of our territorial sea, particularly if they're in transit, which this ship was. One has to recall that it was not going to any port in the UK. It was just transiting UK waters. So it's hard to say what the zone should be, but in the case of the west coast, you'd want to keep those Alaskan tankers several hundred kilometers offshore, so that if they do run adrift, that you have enough time so that you can get tugs out there and take action and rescue the crew.
Just in the 20 seconds we've got left, do you think it's just a matter of time before we do have a major catastrophe off our coastline?
Well, we're expecting one at least every 15 years, and we haven't had one, so yes, we can expect one to happen anytime.
Mr. Graham, good of you to be with us today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
It was Gerald Graham. Mr. Graham is a consultant who specializes in tanker safety. He spoke to us today from our studios in Ottawa.